Okay. So we are extremely passionate about providing free informative sessions to the community at large. Today, we have a special treat in being able to share one of our expertly trained therapists with you, Angelica Malucci. Angelica is a social worker, bilingual in English and Spanish, with almost a decade of experience working with youth and families. She has worked as a pediatric and adolescent social worker in both the hospital and school setting for 6th through 12th graders, and has served as a resource specialist for homeless and refugee families. Angelica has spent the last 4 years as a middle school clinician and created and facilitated the first ever sexual education curriculum in a Bay Area K through 8 grade school. She is honored to walk alongside families as their youth grow up. As a reminder, this session is strictly informative, and it should not take the place of a therapeutic services by a licensed professional. If you or your family member is experiencing a medical or psychiatric emergency, please call 911 or go to your nearest emergency room. If you feel you or your family member could benefit from therapeutic services, please contact us right away. We provide free assessments to help determine the right level of care for your child, even if it's not with us. I will put the link to self-schedule an assessment in the comment section. This evening, Angelica will talk to us about the do's and don'ts when talking to your teens about sexual health, including what they want to know about sex, what they need to know about sexual health, gender identity, and sexuality. We are delighted to have an audience of parents and caregivers joining us via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. As this is your chance to ask an expert, please post your comments in the comment section and we will address them at the end of the presentation. If you miss any parts of this or want a recap, please, you can view it at Jacob's Ladder Therapy's Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. And I will post both of those links in the comment section as well. So without further ado, please welcome Angelica Malucci.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with you all. Thank you for everyone that is joining. Tonight, we are going to be discussing the talk as Demetra shared. So this is for caregivers, families, parents, youth educators, all are welcome. And as clinicians, we believe that social emotional learning involves helping our youth understand how things work in both their brain and their body. And as children grow and change, the way we talk about this topic changes too. And these topics, of course, may feel uncomfortable and are private. So today we're going to share some resources in supporting these conversations at home. So next slide, please. So take a moment to reflect on your own emotions regarding this topic. Which number represents how you feel when discussing these topics with your children and teens? Perhaps you're reflecting on your own experience or awkward conversation you had growing up with a family member or trusted adult. Or maybe these topics were normalized and discussed in a casual way in your household. We know that we're all bringing different experiences, levels of comfort, and knowledge regarding this topic tonight. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we know that it's awkward, but we also know that it's necessary. And I'm sure many of us have been asked a question from children we were not prepared or expecting to answer. And while themes of growing up, hygiene, personal safety, these are relevant at any age, you're the expert on your child. So you know when the timing is right to discuss these matters. And we know that developmentally, teens are less likely to ask us these questions. Next slide, please. And even though they don't necessarily want to talk to us, it's still important to have the talk. And we can see from a recent study with teens in public schools that by age 19, 70% of teens have had sexual intercourse. 1 in 10 students say they have committed sexual violence. Among LGBT plus students, 82% have experienced harassment due to their sexual orientation, and 38% have experienced physical harassment. Young people ages 15 to 24 make up almost 1/2 of over the 19 million new sexually transmitted diseases in the United States. And with all of this, we can see the effectiveness and importance of this education with teens. So even accounting for differences in household income and education, states that teach sexual health and education that covers abstinence as well as contraception tend to have the lowest pregnancy rates. We see that after receiving sexual health and education, 40% of students have delayed sexual initiation, reduced the number of sexual partners, increased condom and contraceptive use, 30% reduced the frequency of sex, including return to abstinence, and 60% reduced unprotected sex. Next slide, please. And this was all based on sexual education that was provided in the school system. So I just wanted to share a brief overview of what sex ed looks like within the school system so you can anticipate the topics and questions your youth may be thinking about. Next slide, please. So the California Healthy Youth Act, while it does vary state by state, many 6th through 12th graders receive this education. And looking specifically at California, this act requires that school districts provide health and HIV prevention education between the ages of again, 6th to 12th grade. So you don't have to have these conversations alone. The school is there to partner with you and ensure your children receive the education that's developmentally appropriate for them. Next slide, please. So what do they talk about during this time? It depends. Again, each grade level has a different requirement of themes and information to cover to meet their developmental age. So defining sexuality, anatomy and puberty, gender identity, healthy relationships and consent, and types of sex and birth control are primarily covered within that 6th through 12th grade range. And we're going to talk about each of these topics today so that we can get a sense of what our teens are learning as well. Next slide, please. So state exemption. So if you do not want your student to participate in this instruction that's provided in schools, you may choose to do that, and your child will typically be confidentially assigned to another activity while this is going on. And I can also put this fact sheet in the chat as well so that you can get a sense of what your rights are as a family going through this process. So there is a link in the Zoom chat here. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to think about at home. What can we do to have these conversations at home? Going through some quick tips. Next slide, please. So it's changed a bit. We didn't have Google when we were growing up. And kids are not going to necessarily ask us things when they can look it up on Google or, find a TikTok video with a tutorial from anything on, how to prevent ingrown hairs to how to use a condom. So we know that they have more access to information than ever before. And not only is there both false and dangerous information on the internet, Google doesn't know your child like you do. So normalizing conversations about these topics, saying, if you see something online that scares you, makes you feel unsafe, confused, or curious, you can always talk with me. So making yourself available as a resource as they navigate these online platforms. Next slide, please. So in a survey that I conducted with middle school students, 90% identified their mother as their trusted adult to discuss these topics with. And now, does that mean they will talk with their mother? Not necessarily, but it does mean that there are a lot of mothers and caregivers working hard to make their children feel safe and comfortable. So again, normalizing identifying trusted adults within your family and also within the community that your child may be able to talk to. So, maybe your cousin would be someone to talk about this with, identifying folks that are relevant to you. Next slide, please. And also making a list of what I wish I knew when I was younger. So this is something you can do with your spouse or partner, or even your friends, making a list of what you wished you knew about how your body changes growing up to share with your teen. So, for example, I wish I knew that I should have kept menstruation supplies in my backpack, or to find a deodorant without aluminum in it. All of the things that with time, you have collected this experience and this wisdom. So sharing this with your teen. And this can help us also as adults to remember some of the challenges that teens are facing and have empathy and compassion. It's also really helpful to teens to, one, get this advice, and two, to see that you've been through this too. Like, wait, you're a real person? I think a lot of our teens have a turning point. What really all of us do when we grow up and we start to see our parents or our caregivers as individuals rather than just the people who care for us. So we see them in this different viewpoint. And this is a really special relationship to have as we watch our teens grow up. Next slide, please. So there are also youth-friendly internet resources for asking these kinds of awkward questions. So Planned Parenthood has a sex ed chatbot. So that means that youth can type in a question and it will respond back with an answer. It covers all kinds of topics, sex, relationships, and growing up. And it's free and private. So anyone can ask at any time. And it is, I can also put this link in the chat, but it is rue.plannedparenthood.org. And of course, there's period tracker apps and TikTok accounts that are for youth. So we know that it will be appropriate for them to view. All right, next slide, please. So thinking about the internet and social media safety. So these are just quick reminders to discuss with your teens, remembering that everything that's posted on the internet is permanent, even after it's deleted. And things like Snapchat or Instagram stories, where pictures, only last a day, they stay there, they remain there. People can take screenshots. So remembering that it never goes away. And some advice we give is to act like your grandmother is seeing everything you post, or if you wouldn't want your future boss or college to see it, don't post it. And to not send nudes, so images of indisposed youth under the age of 18 is considered child pornography and can result in criminal charges and police involvement. We take it very seriously. So these are some reminders to share with your teen. Next slide, please. And now thinking about what's going on for them as they begin to explore their identity. Next slide, please. We know that adolescence is about understanding the self apart from parents, family, school, and all of this exploration is normal and expected. And we can understand gender identity and sexual orientation within the broader sense of identity. So all of these pieces are a part of who you are, but they are not everything about who you are. And we're also more than what we see here represented on this wheel. And while gender identity and sexual orientation are within this wheel, there are complexities within both and within all of these pieces represented here. So we're never limited or confined to one aspect of ourselves. All right, next slide, please. And thinking a little bit more about defining gender expression, identity, attraction, sex. Identity is our gender identity, who we are in our heads, who we know ourselves to be based on what we understand our options to be for gender and how much we align or don't align with those options. So gender identity is our psychological sense of gender. And attraction is the different ways we feel pulled to other people, which is often categorized on our gender or the gender of those we feel drawn to. And this categorization is referred to as sexual orientation, which we will also discuss in a moment. Sex here is referring to the anatomical sex, so the physical makeup of our bodies, and specifically the body parts that we were born with. so that are named as sex characteristics. So both the primary traits that we have at birth, but then also the secondary traits that we may develop later in life. And lastly, expression. So if we think about gender expression, it's all the different ways we present ourselves to the world through our actions, our clothing, our demeanor, and all of the ways that those presentations are socially interpreted. All right, next slide, please. So now looking at sexual orientation, we can think about these as continuums or scales and how they may show up for us personally. It may be helpful to think about it on a scale of 0 to the left and 100% on the right, and exploring where we fall within that spectrum of who we are and who we are attracted to. Next slide, please. And we're going to think specifically about sexuality. Everyone has a sexuality, even if they're not sexually active or have had any experience in romantic relationships. There are many components of sexuality, not just sex. So just thinking about what comes to your mind when you see this, what stands out to you, and what you believe. And it also doesn't matter how many, if any, relationships you've had, just whatever comes to mind for you as you make your own idea and meaning of your sexuality. So knowing that our youth are beginning to explore their own sexuality as they begin to go through puberty and adolescence. Next slide, please. And we also know that as students, youth, and teens grow up, they begin to have relationships. They begin to experience that attraction and develop their sexuality. So relationships are a big topic that come up for them. Next slide, please. We're going to look specifically about how we can foster healthy relationships for our youth. So an important piece of that is defining consent. And consent can be addressed at any age. For kindergartners, we think about it as personal space. And then, of course, as our teens get older, we define consent regarding sexual activity. And this is something that is required for both individuals. They both must give their consent before engaging. And consent is clear. It's a voluntary, knowing agreement to participate in any given activity. So we say, to our teens, consent is not saying things like, I don't want to, stop, I'm not sure, maybe we shouldn't, not right now, no. Unresponsiveness, being unconscious, using any type of physical force or verbal coercion, none of that is consent. Consent is a clear, conscious yes. And so what we can say to our teens when we're discussing this is, this means that you have to ask each person each time if the behavior is okay. Just because you did something in the past doesn't mean that it's okay now. So giving our teens the opportunity to change their mind and giving the other person the space to do so as well. And we also want to highlight with our teens that someone who's under the influence of alcohol and drugs cannot give consent. And an assault can occur if both people have been drinking or using drugs. Even if both people have been drinking or using drugs. So if you are unsure about the situation, the best option is just to avoid all sexual contact. Next slide, please. So we want to think about what are red flags in relationships for our youth. Paying attention to these topics with our teens if we notice that they have, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship where someone is asking our teen for their passwords. So that's a red flag. And we can say to our teens, what are other ways that they can earn your trust? Or what are other ways they can demonstrate they can trust you? So we want to normalize that asking for passwords and password sharing is dangerous. And this is not something that's normal. All right, next slide, please. And then also catfishing. So this is the idea that someone is pretending to be someone they are not online. So sometimes, you know, your partner may feel so scared that you'll cheat on them. They will try to create ways to look at your profile and, you know, get an idea of what you're doing. So they create this false profile to follow you. And this is a red flag and a warning sign. Also getting angry if you're not texting back right away. So if there's not constant communication and the other person gets upset, this is a red flag of a controlling behavior. And next slide, please. And then thinking about jealousy. So both friends and romantic partners should, of course, support the individuality of our teens, who they are both in and out of the relationship. So normalizing that whether or not our youth have a romantic partner, they are still their own person. And it's important for them to have their own sense of identity outside of the relationship. And this goes for friends too. All right, next slide, please. Now we want to look at, you know, what to look for as well. And we want to model these characteristics for our children in all relationships, romantic or otherwise. And that is one way that we can talk about these topics as well, even if our teens have not felt attraction to anyone or have not had a relationship. Examining friendships and looking at this idea of respect and what we want out of any relationship we have with others. And next slide, please. Looking at some more green flags. Again, these are qualities to look for in any kind of relationship with others. You can even ask, you know, with your youth, what they notice in your relationship with them. And next slide. These are some resources for healthy relationships. So they highlight safety. There are opportunities for youth to chat online, to text, to call, and to also look through some red flags that are specific to high school as well. And this also goes for all types of relationships. So on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum as well. Sorry, thank you. Next slide. Working with your child's healthcare provider. So I just wanted to share some quick facts about contraceptives, HIV, and STDs. And I'm going to just highlight the most common forms of birth control used with teens, and by no means am I endorsing these forms, just wanted to share some quick facts. So the IUD, this does not have any STI protection, but does have pregnancy protection. And as we go through, you'll see that the only contraceptive that does have STI protection is the male condom. All right, thank you. And birth control injection, again, not an STI protector, and we can see that there is pregnancy prevention as well. So these are just some quick facts. Thank you. We can move on to the pill. And the next one is the vaginal contraceptive ring. Thank you. Yes. And lastly is the condom. And I know that it says male here. This can be used for anyone regardless of their gender identity. It is the only STI protection that's listed here. So just something to highlight with teens. And next slide. So many youth avoid using condoms because they just don't know how to properly use them or don't have access to them. And I'm not going to play this video right now, but this is a YouTube video from Planned Parenthood that walks you through how to use a condom. So regardless of gender and gender identity and sexual orientation, teaching our youth how to use a condom supports safe practices. So this is really for all, regardless of how they identify. And next slide, please. So just some also quick tips about HIV. So how HIV can be transmitted, which is sexual contact, sharing needles to inject drugs, mother to baby during pregnancy, birth, or breastfeeding. But we know that HIV is not transmitted by air or water, saliva, sweat, tears, closed mouth kissing, insects or pets, sharing toilets, food, or drinks. And we know that there is a lot of history regarding HIV. So normalizing this within our communities helps to break the stigma that's often associated with HIV. Thank you. Next slide. So preventative measures, we can get tested using the condom, choosing activities with little to no risk, not injecting drugs, right? So just kind of normalizing that there are ways we can protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe. And to also, just highlight with any concerns, talk to your healthcare provider. All right, and lastly, I know that was a lot of information very quickly. This is just an overview of what we talked through to reduce risks. So we can see that penetrative sex, the risk is pregnancy, potential risk for some, and also STI or sexually transmitted infection. So in order to reduce risk, using birth control, abstinence, condom use, communication with partner about protection that goes for both our physical protection with contraception, but also our boundaries, thinking about consent and getting tested. And the next type would be oral sex. So the risk there would be, again, the sexually transmitted infection. And reduce, in order to reduce risk, we can use condoms, latex barriers. Again, this idea of communication with partners around boundaries, testing, protection is important no matter the kind of sexual act. And we can see that there are different forms we can use, whether it be abstinence, vaccinations, or the contraceptive forms that we discussed earlier. And, encouraging teens and you all to do what feels right for you and your family. All right, and next slide has some teen resources, which I will drop in the chat. I'll put the link there. I have two fact sheets that are youth-friendly, but then I also have a parent resource list in case you have any additional questions or wonderings. So the first one is teen resources, and then the second is parent resource list. So I'm putting those links in the Zoom chat here. And I know that was a lot of information, so please ask any questions. I don't know if there was any that came up on our other platforms.
Yes, Angelica, there are quite a few questions. I'm going to actually go back to one of your slides. I think this slide was kind of what a lot of the questions were. Our gingerbread and then our gender identity. I'm not sure which slide is going to be the most helpful, but I'll leave it here for now. Sure. Okay, so one of the questions is, can you explain LGBTQIA+ and gender when teens say they're gender fluid? What does that mean?
Sure. So LGBTQIA+ is an acronym that stands for all of the different sexual orientations that folks may have. So L would be lesbian, G would be gay, B would be bisexual, T stands for transgender, although this language is ever changing. So it is something that I often refer back to as time goes on, the language changes. So that is an acronym to describe different sexual orientations. And I'm sorry, the other question was about gender fluid, is that right?
Yeah, what does that mean to be gender fluid?
So gender fluid oftentimes refers to, if we look at this slide, thinking about gender as a spectrum. So if we think about it on a scale from 0 to 100 of either womanness or manness, masculinity, femininity, if we think about it on a spectrum of 0 to 100, fluidity can mean that we fall anywhere in between and that we don't assign ourselves one category. So rather than non-binary, which means that this person does not identify with either being male or female, gender fluid can mean that one day the gender identity may fall somewhere on the scale higher or lower. So again, this can change, and the term may feel different to each person and how they're defining it. And that's my understanding. I am not, an expert in gender, and so I always ask with youth what it means to them to get an understanding of where they're coming from and the information that they have.
Mhm. Do you find that this gender identity and gender expression fluctuates more so with middle school, and then it kind of wears off in high school, or as you get older? Like, is this sort of kind of a new phase, middle school phase?
Yes, we know that middle school is the time where youth start to develop their own identity. So if we go back to that wheel, which is, I think, the 16th slide, it's the slide right above, yeah, that one right there. We know that our youth are going to begin to explore all of these different aspects of their identity, and gender is certainly one of them. And so as they begin to form their sense of self, we can see that it may change by high school. And so just reminding our youth that they are not limited by one aspect of their identity, and giving the space for them to understand themselves more and more. We see that high schoolers tend, because they've had a little bit more life experience and time to form these aspects of their identity, we see that sometimes they change, sometimes they stay the same, depending on the child.
Another question, I've noticed that my teen fluctuates between hanging out with the LGBTQ community and her friends that she's had since elementary school. I think that she hangs out with the LGBTQ group because they accept her and they're less judgmental than her elementary school friends. She has said she's fluid, bisexual since hanging out with the LGBTQ group. However, she seems to be heavily attracted to boys. And as a parent, I'm confused. Is this just a phase?
Yes. So we know, given the historical context of the LGBTQIA plus community, that being together can feel like a safe space. And so we often find and connect with people who we resonate with. And if your youth is identifying as fluid or is starting to use language to describe how they feel, we know that, again, this may change or it might not. It sounds like they're finding community that feels safe and trusted for them. And again, that may change in terms of their sexual orientation and who they are attracted to. And so giving them the space to learn the language, the terminology that goes along with it, and knowing that it may change. And again, it may stay the same. We know that just as I said before, as they grow up through their development, they start to learn more about who they are. And we also learn about who we are through our community.
Okay. This is another question. I'm going to go back to the gingerbread man. I'm sorry, I keep saying gingerbread. One of the questions is, how do I talk to my teens if I personally don't believe, like, my values don't align with your sexual orientation being different than your identity? And how do I talk to my teen about that when they already know that I don't believe in any of this?
Yeah. It sounds like if they're sharing that with you, that they already have a trusting relationship with you and feel safe and comfortable to share that. So it sounds like you already have that relationship with them. And so continuing to create space for those conversations is really amazing that you're doing that already. So I did, I don't know if the link for the parent resources, if I can put it in the, on all of our platforms, but I do have some parent resources as well that can help to understand how you can make sense of it as a parent, so that as you know, our youth and teens are coming to us with this language, and as they develop their sense of self, that you feel informed as well. Within your own value system.
Thank you. You mentioned primary and secondary. You were talking about the sex in this picture, and you mentioned primary and secondary development. Can you explain that, what that means?
Absolutely, yes. So the primary traits that we're born with, those are our sex organs that we're born with. That's the primary traits. And then the secondary traits that develop later in life would be, for example, breasts develop later in life, whereas the sex characteristics that we're born with a vagina, we're born with a penis. So how they transition and change as we grow up.
Okay. Another question is, what if my teen comes to me and says that they want to have a sex change? How do I handle that conversation? How do I handle that conversation?
Yeah, that's a big conversation, thinking about, it sounds like a more permanent and surgical change. Some folks don't define sex change as a surgery. And so I think gaining more understanding on what your youth means when they say that, and exploring, you know, why they feel this way, how to support them in becoming more of who they are, and discussing this with your healthcare provider to think about the physical safety of your youth. So making sure that both you and your youth have all the information regarding what they mean when they say sex change.
Thank you. Another question. What is a good conversation starter? Do we do this over dinner and I just say, hey, you having sex? Or like, how do I start that conversation about sex, like actual like sex acts with my teen or preteen?
Yes. So again, you know your family best. So depending on your family unit, whether you know you want to have this conversation with your spouse, partner, an auntie, a cousin, there, you know your child best. Thinking about, what do you think would speak to them? Is it you know, one-on-one time in the car ride home? Is it, you know, using humor? Is it, you know, watching something on TV or a video on YouTube? You know your teen best. I will say that I often notice these conversations can feel the safest when you're again having that one-on-one alone time, whether it's taking a walk with them or in the car, because there's something else that's going on. It's not just sitting in a room quietly staring at each other. So having that conversation while you're doing something with your teen.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to your first slide.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you can give any tips to any parents who look like or feel like any of these pictures when they're like, okay, I need to talk to my child about sex or sex identity, and they have these emotions. Is there anything that parents could do prior to prepare themselves for the conversation?
Absolutely. It's a tough one. So having some self-compassion, I think being a parent, a caregiver, is one of the hardest jobs. And so just taking a deep breath, knowing that you know your child best, and that you know when it's time to have these conversations. And I know we've talked a little bit about creating a list of what you wish you knew when you were younger. So even just taking some time for self-reflection on what was your experience with this topic, what do you wish you knew? And it can help to talk to your friends and your community about it. Talking with other parents and community members about what's worked, what's not worked, how are they getting the conversation going? So just kind of reflecting on your own experience and the supports and resources that you already have. You're not alone in this conversation. Everyone has to do it. And it's something that I know we don't talk about often. So breaking that ice just within yourself internally.
One other question, you mentioned that teens typically don't use condoms because they don't know how to use them properly. And you mentioned that it may be important for parents to actually teach their teens how to use a condom. Mm-hmm. And then you also mentioned that most teens most middle schoolers identify their mom as their most trusted person. Mm-hmm. For the conversation about how to put on a condom, should mom be teaching that, or should we defer to dad? Is there a difference between if it's a young lady or a young man? Like who should be the one teaching this?
Yeah. So, and I think I said this earlier, I said male condoms. Again, anyone, regardless of their gender, can use a condom. And I apologize for defining it by male, because we know that gender identity, even those who don't necessarily identify as a male, would use a condom when engaging in sex. So whoever the trusted adult is for that person, we know that folks who have used condoms more frequently are going to have more experience and may feel more comfortable sharing the tips and tricks on how to use them. You can, there is a video from Planned Parenthood. If you type into YouTube Planned Parenthood, how to put on a condom, there's a great video. I don't know if our teens will think it's a great video, but it is extremely informative, talking about in terms of how to use it, just highlighting, how to open it, don't use scissors, check the expiration date, things like that, to ensure the safety of using this as a contraceptive.
And as a factual basis, does me teaching my child how to put on a condom increase the likelihood that they're going to have sex?
Yeah, so I think it was let's see what slide it was. If we think about sex education, there is this idea that having these conversations increases, it is, slide 4. This idea that having these conversations increases the likelihood that our teens will have sex, but we can see here that actually after receiving sexual health education, 40% of students delayed sexual initiation, reduced the number of sexual partners, increased condom or contraceptive use, reduced the frequency of sex, and reduced unprotected sex. So having this information equips our teens and our youth to face these challenges and navigate growing up. It's another tool in their toolbox as they inevitably experience and explore their sexuality.
Another question, you mentioned vaccines for STIs. Is there a vaccine? What are the vaccines for STIs? Or what did you mean by that?
So for example, the human papillomavirus, the HPV vaccine is an example of that. So that's something to talk with your healthcare provider about. I believe healthcare providers begin having those conversations with teens. I don't remember what age they start to talk about the HPV vaccine, but I believe at the age of 12 is when doctors will start to have the private conversations with your teen. So if you're at a doctor's appointment and your child's healthcare provider says, all right, you got to leave the room, they start to have conversations about sexual health and these topics. So there's lots of different options to explore and look into.
Thank you. And I have one last question. My teen says they go by they, them pronouns. And that's really hard for me to keep up with. And they get really angry at me when I use the wrong pronouns. What do I do about that?
Yes. So correcting the self, if you are using the wrong pronoun, saying, oops, I forgot. I will try again next time. I will do my best next time. Just those simple, quick corrections if you catch yourself doing it, or if your teen, hears you doing it, just correcting the pronouns. And we know that, if you have known your child with one gender identity and having this change, it can take time. But again, just talking with your teen about that and correcting yourself when you can, when you remember and when they correct you.
Great. I think that is all of the questions. Let me just double check on all the platforms.
Yes, I hope I answered them in a comprehensive way or way that folks wanted or were with clarity.
I think you did. Okay. Well, I would like to thank the ever knowledgeable Angelica Malucci for all the important information you dropped on us tonight. I am thankful to have clinicians on our team and in the community willing to take time out to be real with us about our kids. If you're interested in contacting Angelica for additional speaking engagements, or you need some further in-depth conversation or tips on how to talk to your teen about sex, please, you can email us at info@jacobsladdertherapies.com and we will pass on the information. I would like to thank all of you who joined us today. Again, if you missed any parts of this or want to recap, you can view it in our Jacobs Ladder Therapies Facebook page or on the YouTube channel. And I have posted those links in the comment section. If you feel your family member could benefit from therapeutic services, please contact us. We do provide free assessments to help determine the right level of care, even if it's not with us. And yes, we are accepting new clients for both in-person, walk and talk, and video therapy sessions. And I will put the link to self-schedule an assessment in the comment section. You can view all of our clinicians on our website at www.jacobsladdertherapies.com. And there's also a link there to self-schedule an assessment. Thank you again, Angelica. And to all of our viewers, please stay safe, be well, and have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.